We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Black Agenda has a piece entitled Letter from Republic of Mali to UN on French Aggression and Support for Terrorism in Region. The government of Mali has accused France of numerous violations of its airspace and has requested that the United Nations Security Council investigate. French forces may have left Mali, but the colonizer hasn't changed the way it relates to African nations. For insight into this and to other issues, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to Mali, let's talk about what's going on in Angola.
Well, it's interesting that today, as we speak, elections are taking place in Angola, Southwest Africa. And there are a number of reasons why the U.S. audience should pay attention to these elections. The ruling Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA party, has been in power since independence since 1975. However, the opposition, so-called UNITA party, UNITA, was during the Cold War a favorite of the Republican right. Their leader, Jonas Savimbi, who only passed away a few decades ago, used to be in the Oval Office repeatedly conferring with Ronald Wilson Reagan and other leading Republicans. Recall that it was in 1975 that as Portugal, the NATO ally of the United States, which had been a colonizing power in Angola since the 16th century, was decomposing rapidly because there had been a revolution in Portugal bringing the left to power in April 1974. So what happens is that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, in collaboration with the apartheid authorities in then apartheid South Africa, collaborated to try to prevent the MPLA from coming to power. But what happens is that the Cuban military, under the leadership of President Fidel Castro Ruz, intervenes in a muscular fashion, of course, by the socialist camp led by the then Soviet Union, which then turns the tide against the UNITA and their CIA and apartheid collaborators, and outrages and enrages Washington, which decides that the way to reverse the tides of history is to somehow destabilize the then Soviet Union, which would then obviously hamper the ability in the future of Cubans to be transported across the Atlantic to Africa to help to fight against the oppressors. Now, of course, this is detailed, as you know, in my book, White Supremacy Confronted. But let me say just one more or one or two other points, which is that the Black American audience should pay very close attention to this question of the election in Angola, because the nation of Angola supplied during the bad old days of the African slave trade about 30% of the enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic. And of the Black population listening to you right now, possibly 30% or more are actually of Angolan descent. You know that in Louisiana, the prison there is called Angola State Prison, a reflection of the fact that Black people who were brought to Louisiana were oftentimes Angolan and oftentimes wound up in jail, as still happens today. And so what's going to be interesting about this election in Angola today is whether or not the UNITA, which has not broken its ties with U.S. imperialism, will be able to soar back into influence, if not power, because the MPLA party, with the weakening of the socialist camp, that allowed a rather unique form of class relations to develop. Indeed, the second richest Black woman on earth after Oprah Winfrey happens to be the daughter of the late Angolan president, Jose Eduardo dos Santos. And there is a lot of discontent in Angola because of these skewed class relations. But it's apparent to me, at least, that a victory of UNITA would be a victory for U.S. imperialism. In fact, it would be a blow to Angola's neighbors because even today, the parties of liberation, for the most part, are still in power. Speaking of SWAPO in Namibia, ZANU in Zimbabwe, ANC in South Africa, the other parties of the region as well. And so these parties all have conflicted relations with Washington, which is seeking by means mostly foul to get rid of all of them. And for those who may be deluded to think that getting rid of these parties will improve the life chances of Black people in that part of Africa, I don't think so. In fact, it'll be a great leap backward.
Let me ask you this, because the last polls that I saw had MPLA at 59% and UNITA at like 33%. Now, this was, a little bit ago, some weeks back, but it looked to be a blowout. If, in fact, UNITA, whatever they are, do win, would we be wrong in suspecting foul play?
Well, it's difficult to say because on the one hand, you have a fairly well-respected electoral commission, which the United States might seek to emulate, given the rather chaotic and shambolic elections that take place in this country. And we should have results, I would think, within 2 weeks, given the fact that the MPLA still has control over the levers of power, including the vast oil wealth, which is oftentimes traded to the People's Republic of China, not to mention control over telecommunications media. It would be very difficult for UNITA by foul play to help to serve to erode that kind of advantage. But with Washington being the Bigfoot in that part of Africa, you never can be too sure.
What about the framing of this? I'm looking at a piece from CNBC. Russia's influence is at risk in the southern African nation of Angola as voters head to the polls. Russia's long-held ties with the southern African nation could be in jeopardy as the Moscow-friendly government faces its toughest electoral test. They talk about MPLA being that government, and then, however, the party faces what analysts believe to be its tightest election, and they talk about UNITA. Your thoughts on the framing of this in the context of a Russian interest?
Well, that kind of news reportage, of course, reflects Cold War thinking, which should be a tell for many of us who pay attention. That is to say that despite the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the United States is still seeing itself as in some sort of ideological contestation, not only with Moscow and with Beijing. And I think that's one of the reasons, as suggested a moment or two ago, why they're still seeking to oust the parties of liberation, which are now the parties of power, in Windhoek, in Luanda, in Pretoria, in Harare, etc. However, I don't think that they'll be successful, but we won't know for a few weeks for sure.
There's a letter from the Republic of Mali to the UN on French aggression and support for terrorism in the region. It's interesting because they've been in the process of tossing the French out recently, and they're doing some seriously pushing back. Your thoughts?
Well, France obviously deserves being pushed out of Mali. Recall that it exploited an African nation shamelessly for decades. When Mali came to independence in the 1960s, some decades ago, French intelligence with its U.S. collaborators were responsible for the liquidation of Modibo Keita, the hero of Mali and equivalent of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. This is not surprising for those of us who pay attention to French imperialism and U.S. imperialism in that part of Africa. And I understand why the authorities in Bamako have been sorely disappointed with the performance of the French military, which, after all, were called into Mali in the aftermath of the U.S.-French engineered overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, which allowed tons of weapons to leak out of Libya into the hands of religious zealots, coincidentally enough, who then began to wreak havoc throughout northern Africa in general, including Northwest Africa, which includes Mali. And that meant that the Bamako authorities called on the French to intervene. And despite their reputation for wiping the floor with religious zealots, they did not do so in Mali, which has led, of course, to these very bad relations between Bamako and Paris as we speak.
You have the foreign minister of Mali writing this letter to the United Nations Council, and he is charging France with violating their airspace, particularly those operated by French forces. He says that in addition to acts of indiscipline characterized by refusal to comply with the instructions of air traffic control, they're turning off their transponders. Talk about why France is doing this in Mali now.
I think that France would like to keep a foothold in that part of Africa. It's a part of Africa that has vast mineral wealth, vast natural resources, in light of the bruised relations between France and its neighbor to the east, speaking of Russia, which has similar resources. France and other North Atlantic countries are now looking to Africa to make up for the shortfall. And I hope that Bamako also mentioned in their communication with the United Nations authorities that just a month or so ago, you had EU forces landing in Bamako without the authorization of the Bamako authorities. This was a kind of piratical neocolonialism that I thought had disappeared. Obviously, I was wrong. Certainly, the Bamako authorities have cozied up to Moscow. The foreign minister and other leaders have been making a regular stop in Russia in recent weeks and months. And that also has Washington and Paris upset. So I trust and I hope that the Bamako authorities have a kind of coup insurance, because certainly that's the alternative that the United States and France will be pursuing sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we see a lot of advancement for independent and revolutionary movements in South America and Latin America, Central America, et cetera. Of course, they don't have AFRICOM there. We got about 2 minutes. Your comparison, do you think Africa will be able to move in that direction also?
Well, I would say this. I would say the productive forces in South America are more developed than they are, at least in Brazil and Argentina in particular, than in the leading countries of Africa. And that development acts as a kind of shield that helps to fend off the kind of militaristic penetration of which AFRICOM is a specialist. We know that in recent days and weeks, AFRICOM, for example, has been steadily bombing Somalia, and that has led to the militant zealots in Somalia striking back against the government. However, I'm happy to say that these elections, not only in Angola, but also in Kenya, an election which is still being sorted out in East Africa, is a signal that there is a kind of stability that is emerging in Africa that too will act as a shield, helping to fend off the thrusts and the lances of the North Atlantic imperialists.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis. We look forward to